I have the distinct honor of introducing my daughter, Abigail Backer, to you, who is a social work in an agency called Youth Services of the North Shore, Glenview, and Northbrook, Illinois. And she has her master's social work degree and social policy, right? That too, from University of Chicago. And she's a clinical social worker at this agency. And most of her work is focused on adolescents and teens, with a special emphasis on Spanish-speaking students, but not exclusively. And when we were looking around for a speaker on this topic, I suddenly realized that she does this. She goes to high schools and has clients who are in the LGBTQ area. And so and also even before she became a social worker, was dealing with this issue a lot with youth group in a Jewish setting in Beth Emmet in Evanston, Illinois. So I'm going to let her take the program away. She's going to speak for about 45 minutes with her PowerPoint, and then there'll be lots of time for Q&A. And here comes another person. Harriet Lavin is entering, and we need to enable live transcription. Got it. And I'm going to let Abby take it away. Put your PowerPoint up there.
Yeah, share the screen, I think.
Okay, share the screen. Good point. Yeah, thank you. And show. I should just let you do it.
No worries.
Share screen. There you go. Share. And I'll put this over here. And I'll let you go from there. You can put it on presentation mode.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm not sure. Can the folks on Zoom see me? Can you give me a thumbs up? Great. I can't see myself, but that's probably.
I can't either.
Okay.
You're over on the side.
Yeah, but it's dark again here on the screen. So, let me just try one thing. Thank you for your patience.
It was when I logged in the other side and it went back on, but it may have something to do with presentation.
We can hear you fine. I mean, not that we don't want to see your beautiful face, but
yeah, I think we're just gonna wing it. This is pretty typical for my virtual presentations. It's lovely to actually be able to see you and see the folks in person. A lot of times when I do these presentations, it's like speaking into the void because students can see me, but I can't see them. So now the tables have turned and it's pretty interesting. So we're just going to go with it. So it's great to be with you all. Thanks again for your patience with the tech issues and the balancing in person and virtual. I know we're all used to it by now, but I think it's just worth mentioning that your patience is appreciated. So my name is Abigail Backer. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a clinical therapist at an organization called Youth Services of Glenview, Northbrook. I'll tell you a little bit about Youth Services and what we do there. So we do pretty much everything, which is one of the things I really love about working there. There we go. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit. Oh, I can see myself now. Look at that. We are a 501c3 nonprofit based in Glenview, but we serve young people ages 5 to 25 all over the Chicagoland area. As Rabbi mentioned, my expertise is in working with children and adolescents and specifically Spanish-speaking families, but not exclusively. So we provide individual and group therapy to children and their families. We do accept insurance, but we also are an agency that offers something called sliding scale, which means that we lower the cost of services to as little as $1 per session to ensure that there are no barriers to receiving mental health services. We really believe that mental health is health and a human right, and I feel really lucky to be part of an agency that models that. So we have all sorts of different groups. We have academic tutoring programs. We have different types of therapy groups, and we have an incredibly robust Pride program. And as part of that Pride program, we do workshops like this in a subset of that program, which is called SHARE, and SHARE stands for Sexual Health and Relationship Education. So through that SHARE program, clinicians like myself will volunteer to go to high schools or community agencies in the area and do presentations just like this. So this presentation that I'm doing today is one that I've done at New High School, Highland Park High School, all sorts of different places. And so you'll see that we're going to get into some scenarios later on that may seem sort of geared toward adolescence in terms of social relationships and navigating identities in social relationships. And that is because this is a presentation that we use for high school students, middle school students, educators, and all different types of settings. So that's a little bit about youth services. Feel free to ask me more questions about it at any time. I'm a huge fan of where I work, which is pretty lucky. And the Pride program is something that's truly exceptional. We offer LGBTQ support groups for youth of all different ages, as well as a trans youth and family summit on an annual basis. So this Pride education and support that we offer to the LGBTQ community is a really important part of who we are as an agency. So before we start, this is something that I do in every group, any workshop, any presentation. Just want to review some group agreements to make sure that everybody's on the same page. In this case, we all know each other, which is really nice, but lots of times folks are new to each other in a space, and it's nice to just make sure everyone knows what to expect from their facilitator and what the facilitator expects from the group as well. So what's said here stays here. That's really a main tenet of our work as clinicians. Confidentiality means creating a safe space where people feel like they can share things and ask things that are not going to leave the space, right? So when I say this in a high school setting, want to make sure that kids aren't going to the next class and saying, oh my God, can you believe what so-and-so said? That applies for us as well, right? We want to support each other. And in order to do that, we need to have some safety built in and knowing that what's shared in here stays here. That being said, we want you to take what you learn out of the room and continue the conversation. So I think that it's really important to understand that what we are learning today and what we're talking about today is not a one and done. This is an ongoing conversation amongst ourselves and our community members with our young people and their families. And so what's learned here leaves here. Please take it with you. We want to practice respect and support for one another, so not judging. And along those lines, the bravery that comes with asking questions. There really are no stupid questions. I know it's something that people say a lot, but I really do mean it. There are not stupid questions. That's what a safe space means, is having the ability to ask questions that you might not feel comfortable asking in another setting. And that takes a lot of bravery, right? That being said, you all have a lot of knowledge and expertise from your lived experience that we want you to share as well. So this isn't just me sharing knowledge with you. I want you all to share your knowledge, your questions, and your brilliance with us as well. Any other group agreements or things that people feel like they need to feel safe in this space? All right, we're going to jump into it. So we're talking today about gender and sexuality specifically in regards to the LGBTQ community, what those identities might mean for some people. But I like to zoom out and sort of go from a macro perspective first, which is that we all have identities, whether or not we identify as a member of the LGBTQ community, we all have identities. This could be religious affiliations, hobbies that we enjoy, roles that we play in our family or in our communities. So I'd love to hear folks either can put in the chat or folks who are here can just go ahead and share. What are some identities that you have? Yeah. So we heard mother, grandmother, friend. So family relationships, right? Teacher, professional identity, Jewish, a religious identity. Excellent. Other folks have identities that they feel comfortable sharing? Yeah, absolutely. So those relationships, who we are in relationship to other is part of how we see ourselves, right? I would throw out some interests, maybe obsessive gardening. That would be one of my identities, or being a dog mom. Those are all different types of ways that we see ourselves, partially in relationship to others, but also different communities that we might be part of, professional communities, religious communities, etc. I'm just trying to see if anyone threw anything here in the chat, but I can't seem to see it.
There is something in the chat. It's up above. There's a banner up above.
Oh, but I can't see that.
Huh.
Maybe if I minimize. How do I do that?
Escape. The escape exit show.
I just want to make sure I'm seeing everything here. Thanks again for your patience. Just want to make sure that the folks who are on Zoom are, oh, here we go.
That's the closed captioning.
I know.
Okay.
Here we go. Chat. Excellent. Okay. Thank you for your patience. We've got some more: husband and dad, caregiver, friend, a queer woman of color. So this person has shared both a racial identity as well as an LGBTQ identity, American Jew, so both an identity of religion and nationality, the safe adult, and can't see the slides. Yes, that's because I stopped sharing. So I will figure out a way somehow, some way to both share and see your comments. But I'm glad I got to see those, because we really see a huge range of how people identify themselves, right? And how we identify ourselves can change depending on what spaces we're part of, as well as where we are in our lives. So those of you who said grandmother or dad, you know, that was not an identity that you always had, right? So it's really important for us to think about identity as something that is fluid and can change over time. Are my Zoom folks seeing the slides? Give me a thumbs up.
We can see them, but it's reduced. It's like not the whole slide.
Sure, I will do my best.
It seems like when you share it in slideshow mode is when it's screwing up. Maybe just leave the PowerPoint deck up.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, because you're in slideshow mode. There
Like-
you go. See, now we can see it.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Danke.
And you're not hearing Abby as well if you'd like to?
All right. I believe I'm frozen, but I am just going to keep going because we have a lot that we want to get through today.
And we can hear you fine on the Zoom.
All right, you can see I'm scratching my head. I'm puzzled. I'm contemplative. It's all good. So we are going to now sort of zoom in a little bit. We're talking about identities on a broad scale. And so zooming in, specifically thinking about sexual and gender identity, right? Everybody has a sexual and gender identity. So we're going to start with gender. And I'd like to invite everybody to take a minute to think about maybe the first time that you thought about your gender. How did you find out, or when did you first learn about your gender? What did you learn about it? Some of these maybe early childhood memories of toys or ways that we socialized. Some of us who I know myself included, and I identify as cisgender. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. I didn't really think about my gender very much until I started to have conversations like this. So this is different for everyone, and that has a lot to do with gender and sexuality and privilege, right? Depending on how you identify, you may or may not have thought about what your gender means to you. And so everybody's relationship with their gender and their sexual identity is different. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So thinking about gender as three-dimensional multidimensional, really, we're going to look at 3 areas specifically, is really, really helpful. For those of you who are here, there's a piece of paper that says the gender unicorn on it. For those of you who are joining by Zoom, we'll make sure to send you that link. This is something that I'm going to reference throughout the presentation. So thinking about the multiple dimensions of gender, let's start with identity. So gender identity means someone's personal sense of what their gender is, how somebody feels on the inside about what their gender is. So using myself as an example, I identify as female, and that is my gender identity on the inside, meaning when I think about myself as a person and the way that I perceive myself and the way that I want others to perceive me, that is my gender identity, right? Expression means what you show on the outside. So you might feel something on the inside and show it on a different way on the outside. How we express our gender has lots of different forms. It can be how we dress, how we wear our hair, what types of activities we engage in. This is one way that people can express their identity, right? So again, identity is what you feel on the inside. That is this top part right here, gender identity. Expression is how you show it, how you wear it, what you put out into the world. And then the body dimension of gender has to do with the physical structure that we're born with. Sometimes this aligns with our identity. So you could see some overlap between identity and body if someone is born with a physical structure that matches their gender identity. And we're going to talk more about that. Sometimes they don't match. Sometimes the parts that people are born with don't match with the way that they feel on the inside or the way that they want to show themselves on the outside. And that is, in a nutshell, what trans means, but trans means lots of different things, and we're going to talk more about that. But I think it's really helpful to look at these 3 areas and how they intersect and how they're different for every single person. Someone may identify as one way on the inside. They may express themselves another way on the outside, and they may only feel comfortable expressing that identity in certain communities where they feel safe, as an example. Please stop me if you have questions as we're going along. Just making sure I can't see the chat at all. So folks, if you do have a question and you're on Zoom, just please unmute yourself and ask me because I can't see the chat and I want to make sure everyone has the space to get their questions answered. So gender is a type of identity. Gender is multidimensional. We can look at identity, expression, and physical body when we're thinking about all the different parts that make up someone's gender identity. So gender identity is different than sex assigned at birth. And you'll see that on your gender unicorn here. That's why it has a different category. Going back just one slide, when we're looking at body is talking about sex assigned at birth.
Someone's trying to get in.
Alice Thompson, hey, admit. All right, so there's a lot of terms I'm throwing out at you. Please stop me if you have questions, but really, really important takeaway is that gender, sex, and sexuality are 3 different things, okay? So gender, we've talked about a little bit. Sex assigned at birth is the label that we're assigned based on our body parts. So there are really 3 main sexes assigned at birth. So thinking about a delivery room, right? The baby is born, baby has a penis and testicles, and the doctors say it's a boy. That is that child's sex assigned at birth, right? Same with female. If a baby is born and it has a vagina, then the doctor would say, this is a female, this is a girl, and that's its sex assigned at birth. Intersex is also a designation that can be assigned at birth. Intersex can mean different things. There are really 2 main types. One is different types of genitalia. So perhaps a child has an enlarged clitoris or internal testicles, this means that they're intersex, right? They have both male and female genitalia. This does happen. It's actually a lot more common than people realize. Additionally, there are chromosomal variations. So XXY, for example, is an intersex designation, meaning it's not XX, it's not XY. This is just the way that somebody is born. And so they would be designated intersex as their sex assigned at birth. Again, this is something that is a lot more common than people realize, but we don't have these conversations very often, right? So there's a lot more awareness of intersex, intersexuality in the LGBT community because these conversations are had a lot more frequently and openly, right? So this is really important in thinking about the way that sex and gender interact. So like we said before, gender identity is the words we use to describe ourselves, not the words that somebody gave us in the delivery room, but the way we believe ourselves to be. And this is different for every person. So over here on the left, cisgender is a term that you may have heard or may be new to you. Cisgender, and I identify as cisgender. What this means, is that my sex assigned at birth, female, matches my gender identity, which is also female. Another example would be someone who is assigned male at birth and their gender identity is male. They would be cisgender because their sex assigned at birth and their gender identity are aligned. Someone who is transgender means someone whose gender identity is different than their sex assigned at birth. So perhaps someone was born with male genitalia and they were assigned male at birth, but as they grow in their life, they become socialized, they understand themselves more and develop and grow as a person. They realize and come to see themselves as female. This is just an example, right? So that person would be transgender because their sex assigned at birth doesn't match the gender identity that they perceive themselves to be. I'm going to pause there because I think that this is really the crux of a lot of understanding going forward, and just want to make sure folks don't have questions or comments. It's okay. Don't be scared. Yeah.
I'm assuming then that identity is like
Yep.
it means something.
Yep. So that's a perfect segue into, well, we're not going to get there. We haven't gotten there yet, but you're spot on. There's a third area here, which is sexuality. Sexuality and sexual orientation, which are the two parts here on the bottom of your gender unicorn, who people are physically attracted to and emotionally attracted to, is the third dimension of identity that we're talking about here. So when you walk away today, one of the takeaways I hope you take with you is that gender identity, sex, and sexuality are three different things. And how those things interact with each other and how they intersect makes up one's both gender and sexual identity. Does that answer your question? And we're going to talk more about it for sure. I really wish I could see the chat, but a girl can dream.
I think you'd have to stop share for a minute just to check on it.
Well, I think hopefully folks will unmute themselves if they have questions. So getting a little more specific here, what are some gender identities? We've named a few so far. Think about maybe how you identify. So female, right, and male are two types of gender identities. Something that you might hear, or a term that you might have heard, is non-binary. Non-binary is a gender identity that really gets at the idea that gender isn't just male or female, right? Binary, bi means two. So non-binary means not two, means that folks who identify as non-binary sort of reject the idea that there are only two genders, right? They identify as, maybe they don't identify as transgender, maybe they identify as non-binary, which means that they're sort of rejecting this idea of gender as an either or in general. Transgender is also another type of gender identity. So these are some terms that you may have heard floating around, and I think it's just helpful to put them in a bucket of gender identity, right? So again, sex assigned at birth, really you got three options: male, female, intersex. Gender identity is a little bit more expansive, right? Because it has to do with how people feel on the inside, how they express themselves on the outside. That's when you might start to hear terms like transgender or non-binary.
Gender neutral or
Gender fluid. Yes. It's really a personal preference. I also think that people who identify as transgender are really often feeling more pulled to the another type of gender. So let's say someone's assigned male at birth. If they, oftentimes when people identify as transgender, that means that they identify as female, right? So they're selecting another gender identity. Non-binary is sort of an opting out of the options. It's sort of the way that I think of non-binary, is that none of these options apply to me. I don't identify as female. I don't identify as male. I identify as myself. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that it's really important to mirror the language that people use themselves. Yeah, Dorothy.
But non-binary also being like fluid.
Yeah, I think they're very similar. I think non-binary and fluid really get at the idea of gender being a spectrum, as opposed to you're either this or that, right? So fluid, non-binary, those are all terms that sort of allow people some more flexibility. Folks, and a lot of the young people that I work with who identify as trans, they very much feel that they're sort of trapped in the wrong body, and that they identify specifically with the opposite gender. Yeah, does that help answer your question? Did I see another hand over here? No.
What about queer?
We're going to get to queer. Queer is more of a term that's used to describe sexuality. And we're going to talk a little bit about its history and how it's a complicated word in the community. But queer is a term that definitely falls into the category of sexuality. That being said, sometimes you will hear people say that they identify as genderqueer. When you hear the word gender in front of anything, that means that people are talking about their gender identity. So if someone says genderqueer or gender fluid, that means they're talking about how they feel about themselves and how they express their identity to the outside. If someone says I'm queer, that could mean that they're talking about their sexual orientation. It could also mean they're talking about their gender, which is why it's really important to ask people questions and make sure that you're understanding the words that they're using to describe themselves.
One other question, I'll be back with the fluid gender, I forgot the term, but fluid. Is that also where at one point somebody may feel more female and then another time more male, and it can go back and forth, and it's not an absolute like versus transgender that they're this or they're this, but where it kind of can go back and forth depending what they're feeling at that particular moment?
Absolutely. That's really well said, Ben. I think the fluidity allows people a little more room to be flexible and explore. And if they're not sure about their identity, choosing a term like non-binary or gender fluid allows them a little bit more room to sort of see how they feel in different days and different spaces and have some flexibility in that. Yes.
This day was my coaching. Was telling me about a friend of hers in high school who, every day she would ask, what are your pronouns?
Ah, yes.
Was that true?
Absolutely. Super, super helpful. And I think that's a great way to model the importance of asking people how they identify. I think sometimes we feel afraid to ask people about their pronouns or how they identify, and we're going to talk about pronouns in a little bit. But I think I've never really had an experience where someone has been offended because I ask them to clarify how they want to be referred to, whether that's their name, their pronouns, anything like that. People really often, most often, are really appreciative of being asked. And I just had that experience with a client the other day who has recently decided to start using another name. And I had reached out to them by text message, and I used their old name, or sometimes you'll hear young people referring to it as their dead name, meaning the name that they don't want to be called anymore. And I said, you know, I just realized I think I called you by the wrong name. Can you remind me what name it is that you prefer to be called? And we had a great conversation about it, right? That open curiosity is a really important part of understanding where people are, because that fluidity can mean that things are changing, right? Just like we talked about our identities having changed at the beginning, right? We weren't always dads and grandmas, teachers and mentors. We changed and grew into those over time, right? Gender identity, pronouns, names, those are also things that are flexible and can change over time. Yes, funny.
This is new. Years ago, we didn't talk about this. I don't think we have a cousin. And maybe it was different.
Mm-hmm.
And he's an artist, and he lived in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
But we knew he was different. We didn't call him queer or
Yeah.
they. It's only been the last couple of years that we had these.
Yeah. And I feel really grateful to be growing up in a time where there are a lot more open conversations about this, because I think that there have been a lot of people who've been living in the shadows or in the closet for a long, long time, not because they weren't trans or they weren't non-binary, but because there wasn't the language, there wasn't the openness or conversation being had where people felt like they could say, hey, this is how I want to be called. This is how I want to be referred to. So it's been really interesting to watch it evolve. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think things have definitely gotten better. I also think that there is a long way to go. I think that there's a lot of fear in the LGBTQ community right now about certain types of legislation being passed that can restrict their freedom and bodily autonomy. And we have come really far, right? We're here having this conversation in the synagogue. When I was the director of youth programs at Beth Emmet, our curriculum for 7th graders for their B'nai Mitzvah was all about sex and sexuality, relationships, gender identity, substance use, all types of things, right? And that was revolutionary. I still think it is, because when houses of worship engage their communities in conversation, and not only provides education, but it also sends a message that we don't just say we're inclusive, we act it out. We practice that in our daily lives. And I can talk more about that curriculum in a little bit. I want to go ahead and sort of zero in on this idea of transgender, what that means. So trans, we're going to talk about it in a little bit. Trans doesn't mean transition, but sometimes in the trans community, there are a lot of transitions that people can go through should they decide to. And so we're looking at 3 main areas of transition: legal, medical, and social. So let's think about some examples of what these transitions might mean. What would an example of a legal transition be? Those of you on Zoom, feel free to unmute yourselves. Those of you here, just shout it out. Yeah, changing your name. Absolutely. I would say that sort of goes in this area of in between legal and social, and every person is different, right? Because my example of my client is someone who has changed their name socially, but has not taken the step to change their name legally, right? So they're kind of in this in-between area. Changing your name on your driver's license, right? That is a legal transition that requires a certain procedure to go through. Great example. What are some other examples of legal transition? Yeah, birth certificate, right? People will call it your identity marker. So like on your birth certificate to match your passport or your driver's license. If someone wants to change their gender marker on those documents, that's a legal transition that they have to go through certain steps to get that accomplished. Great. What about medical transitions? Surgery, yep. So you might hear people say top surgery or bottom surgery. So top surgery meaning the top half of someone's body. This could be breast reduction or augmentation. Bottom surgery means changing genitalia. Other types of medical transitions include hormone treatment. There's different types of that. So there's both taking hormones, testosterone and estrogen. There's also something called puberty blockers, which I see a lot of my younger clients utilizing. Basically what that means, it's a type of treatment that delays puberty in a way so that the young person can have a less dysphoric adolescence basically, and then later decide if they want to go ahead and do something more permanent like taking hormones or having a surgery. Puberty blocker is sort of like the first step for younger people who have not yet experienced puberty, should they want to take that medical transition. And these are just a few examples. What about a social transition?
How you want to be called, telling people how you want to be referred to.
Yeah, how you want people to call you or refer to you. I heard pronouns here, right? So somebody may have been assigned female at birth and socialized as a female, but they want to make a transition socially and use they, them pronouns, right? That would be an example of a social transition. Also, how people dress would be another example of a social transition, right? They're not necessarily wanting to do a legal or a medical transition, but maybe they were assigned male at birth, but they want to wear a dress. And that might be an example of a social transition, okay? But what's really important here is that transition means lots of different things. Someone might engage in all of these areas, one of these areas, or none of these areas, okay? Trans doesn't mean transition. So someone doesn't have to legally change their name or have top surgery or use hormones in order to identify as trans. It's different for every person. And you'll notice these handy dandy Venn diagrams kind of mimic the original Venn diagram we were looking at gender with body, expression, and identity, okay? So much like gender identity as a whole, transgender identity specifically has overlapping and distinct areas where each individual can choose to engage or not with any of these different options. Gonna pause for a moment, mostly because I'm thirsty, but also want to see if there are any questions or comments. Y'all are doing great. So pronouns, just like we said, are sometimes used in social transitions. Pronouns are a part of speech. Pronouns are a way that we refer to someone, each other, and pronouns are also a really important part of social transitions that people can make. I would say most often we see young people, just going back a second, most often we see young people making social transitions in their gender identity before they take any steps to do medical or legal transitions. Pronouns are usually one of the first social transitions that I see young people making. So these are some examples of pronouns. So he, him, and she, her are the pronouns that I think most of the ones that we are most familiar with. They, them are pronouns that we have heard in other ways, used in different ways grammatically, but you will hear a lot of people in the trans community using they, them as their preferred pronouns. And thinking back to gender identity and those terms, non-binary, genderqueer, gender fluid, they, them sort of fall into the category of people who may have been assigned female at birth, for example, but they don't necessarily feel female on the inside. They don't express themselves as traditionally female on the outside. And so they might want to be referred to as they, them instead of she, her, which is not true for everybody. Now, this is probably new for many of you, neopronouns. Neo meaning new, literally. These are sort of evolving very quickly. I don't know a lot of people who use these, young people who use these, but I do know that it's increasing more and more. The reason someone might want to choose to use neopronouns are because basically these options are not satisfactory. They, them can feel awkward in grammar and conversation. They, them can also feel othering to some people. And so some people, for example, might want to be referred to as Zer instead of they, them, or she, her. The idea of neopronouns is that language can be pretty limiting, right? We know that. I think about that with Hebrew a lot, and how Hebrew has just evolved over time from a biblical language to something that can describe technology and airplanes and all sorts of things that didn't exist when the language was created. And so I think of neopronouns in a similar way, in that language can be restricting at times, and neopronouns allow people to choose ways to be referred to that can be a little bit more expansive, a little bit more creative. But this is also why it's so important to ask people how they want to be referred to and to mirror that language, because we don't want to make assumptions about people based on how they look or what we think they identify as. And this is a real opportunity to learn from people who maybe use neopronouns to understand, well, why is it that you prefer Zer and not they, them? Tell me more about that. I think it's a real opportunity to use curiosity to increase our understanding. I'm gonna pause for a second. I know this is a confusing one. Any questions about pronouns? So they, zer, and I am. Yep, basically. Different words. Also, I have heard some people like to be called it's. It just totally depends. And so you'll see a lot of debate about this as well in the LGBTQ community. I think that there is a lot of connection and alignment on the need for better pronouns, but there's not necessarily agreement among everybody about what that means. So there's a lot of creation, there's a lot of innovation that's happening in the community. These neopronouns, I would say, are probably within the last 5 years, we're starting to see these neopronouns start to develop, maybe 10 years. So like you're saying, Bunny, these terms were non-existent, right? Maybe you heard trans, but that was sort of out there in the ether, and nobody was talking about pronouns, right? Nobody was talking about neopronouns. If people are interested in learning more about neopronouns, I've got some great videos that I can send to you of people who are part of the community explaining why they feel that neopronouns are a better fit for them than pronouns. I also think neopronouns fall into the category of maybe anti-establishment pronouns, in the ways that non-binary is sort of a rejection of gender as either or. I see neopronouns as a rejection of the restrictive terminology that has been forced on a lot of people for many, many years. So I do have a scenario, but I think I'm going to skip it and send these out unless people feel like, because I want to get to sexual orientation, unless I'm hearing a really strong preference for going through this scenario. No? Okay. There is one that I do want to go through, which is this. What do you do if you mess up someone's pronouns?
According to my granddaughter, the other person will give at least a good time. And that's what I'm trying to respect that.
Absolutely. So I don't know if the Zoom folks could hear, but that if you mess up, but you're trying your best and you're making a good faith effort, that goes a long way. Absolutely. So my advice to you all is that if you mess up someone's pronouns, own it and move on. I see a lot of people who mess up someone's pronouns and will just apologize profusely and berate themselves and, oh, I'm so horrible and I'm the worst person ever and I can't believe that I did that, coming from a really good place. But then what ends up happening is that the person who they misgendered ends up having to comfort them for their mistake, right? It comes from a really good place. But really the best thing that you can do is just to say, oh, crap, I think I messed up your pronouns. I'm sorry. If you're not sure, that's a great opportunity to ask them, oh, I'm sorry, I think I messed up your pronouns. Can you remind me what pronouns you prefer? And move on. Not acknowledging it is also not a good option, right? If you do misgender somebody, and misgender is a term that means maybe referring to someone by the wrong pronouns or the wrong name. If you do misgender someone, like your granddaughter said, an acknowledgement goes a really long way, but not a long-winded one. Just an acknowledgement and then moving on is very much the best way to move forward if you mess up someone's pronouns. It happens. We all make mistakes. We all call people by the wrong name. People in our own family call them by the wrong name, or call the dog by, the spouse's name, whatever. We all do it. It happens. We make mistakes, and that's part of learning and being human. And everybody understands that. Questions about that? All right. So again, this is a scenario, and these scenarios are really helpful. I'll send them out afterwards, but these are the scenarios that in a high school setting, we do some multiple choice, we do some troubleshooting. I'd hear what the kids have to say. Basically, this is just an implementation of what we just talked about and asking students to put that into practice. All right, sexual identity. So we've covered a lot. Hang with me. Gender identity, sex assigned at birth, and sexual identity. Also, sometimes you'll hear sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is the same way of saying sexual identity, right? So sexual identity, which are these two bottom arrows, and there's some great explanations on the back. Please take these home. Sexual identity is physical attraction and emotional attraction, the words we use to describe who we want to share our hearts and our bodies with. So some examples of sexual identities are straight, which is a slang way of saying heterosexual, which means, anyone? Yeah, so someone who is attracted to people of the opposite gender, right? This is where sexuality and sexual orientation interact with gender, right? These aren't silos, they're intersecting. So myself as an example, I identify as female and I am attracted to men, those who identify as male. That means that I'm straight or heterosexual. Gay refers to people who are attracted to the same gender. Oftentimes and historically, gay has been used to refer to male identified people who are attracted to male identified people. I would say that's still pretty true, but sometimes you'll hear people refer to themselves as gay as sort of a catch-all term. So gay and lesbian both mean people who are attracted to the same gender, whether they're male or female. Yes, making sense?
I'm gay. I'm not gay.
I think it's been around for a long time. I think that there hasn't been a lot of visibility. I think that a lot of that really can date back to Stonewall and sort of the 60s and 70s when the gay community started to get a lot more vocal and a lot more visible and a lot more under threat and scrutiny. But gay has been used in many different contexts for a long time. I think it's just sort of like the circles that you're exposed to and that you're not exposed to, right? I think that because of safety reasons, the queer community and LGBTQ community has been historically a lot more insular, right? Bisexual means someone who is attracted to both genders, so either male or female. Pansexual is a term you may or may not have heard before. This means someone who's attracted to all genders. This includes people who are non-binary, people who are trans, people who are gender fluid, right? If we're thinking about gender as more than just male or female, which is bi, right? Pansexual is a term that's a lot more all-encompassing. It's not just either male or female, it's all genders, okay? Asexual, or sometimes you will hear people refer to that as ace. That means people who do not experience sexual attraction to any gender. And queer is sort of a term that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. As an ally, meaning someone who is not part of the LGBTQ community, but is a supporter of the community. I will never refer to someone as queer unless they refer to themselves that way. And that is because that is a word that has been historically used to discriminate against people in the LGBTQ community. This word has been reappropriated, meaning it's been taken back, and some people feel that by taking it back and wearing it with a badge of honor, they're sort of conquering that dark history, but not everybody feels that way, right? So someone who identifies as queer, I would say it's sort of similar to pansexual in the sense that attraction to all people, regardless of gender identity. But again, mirroring people's language is really the most important thing here. If people refer to themselves as queer, then I think it's okay to refer to that person as queer, but only if they refer to themselves that way. So sort of coming first full circle, identities are always evolving. Identities shifting over time has a lot to do with psychological development, what people are exposed to, both in terms of media, culture, different communities. And I think that it's really important to respect the fact that identity can change. We sort of take it for granted, right? These roles that we've grown into in our lives, therapist, grandparent, it feels natural when it happens in its own course, right? But we don't necessarily think of gender identity and sexuality as having that equally natural evolution, but it really is for a lot of people. And so I think one of the main takeaways, especially for those of you who are wondering how to support young people who identify as part of the LGBTQ community, is to be open to the fact that identities change. So in this scenario, which we don't have to go all the way through, but basically the reaction is from a friend. One day she's straight, the next day she's lesbian, now she's pan, she's just doing it for attention, right? I think we've all heard this from people, or maybe we've thought it before and didn't say it out loud. But the important thing to remember here is that people are just trying to figure themselves out. And life is really hard and complicated as we encounter new experiences and new people and new communities. We grow and we change. That's the best part of being human. And gender identity and sexuality, sexual identities are really no different. And so it's really important for us to be open to the fact that the only thing that's constant in life is change. And last but certainly not least, I just want to make sure we're familiar with the term ally. An ally is someone who doesn't identify as a member of the LGBTQ community. Also, I just want to draw your attention real quickly to this plus sign, which sometimes you'll see followed by LGBTQ. There are some other letters that come with this acronym. Sometimes you'll see LGBTQIA, IA meaning intersex and asexual. The plus sign is really I think, an adventure, an invitation for people to choose their own adventure, right? The idea that sometimes, just like pronouns are not always satisfying and can be restricting, terms and definitions are also sometimes restricting. And so that plus sign means, and then some. Be curious, ask people how they identify. And so as allies, that's one of the most important things that we can do to support and advocate for people in the community, by being curious, by asking questions, and by holding a non-judgmental and supportive space, which I know is not always easy, but is definitely very much appreciated, particularly by young people who often are just looking for that safety, that validation, that they're a cool person, no matter how they identify. So I'd like to stop for questions. You'll see here my contact information at my organization, as well as my co-facilitators for this SHARE program, Sexual Health and Relationship Education. So stay connected with us in that way. But I definitely want to make sure that we have some time for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing so I can read the chat and see where we're at. Let's see. Oh no, you can, okay, I hope you can see the slides. Any other questions or comments? This is really an opportunity for you to ask anything that you've wondered about gender, sexuality, LGBTQ youth work. Can I explain pansexual again? Yes. So pansexual is a sexual identity, right? So it's not a gender identity, it's a sexual identity, meaning how someone is physically or emotionally attracted to other people. And pansexual is a term that encapsulates all genders, meaning someone is not just attracted to men or women, but perhaps people who identify as non-binary or queer or gender fluid. So it's a more expansive definition of sexuality for those who don't necessarily just feel attracted to someone who's traditionally male or traditionally female. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much, Abby.
Yeah, of course.
So Abby, I'm curious if there's correlations between the increase in need for mental health among adolescents and this uncertainty, this exploration, generally, just in social media.
Yeah, I think the increase in the need for mental health services has a lot more to do with like social media, like you're saying, but also the pandemic, and also the fact that all of our young people have to do active shooter drills at their school, right? So I think that correlation doesn't equal causation in this case. I think that there is a real lack of accessibility of mental health support services for LGBTQ youth specifically, which is why organizations like ours are so important. But I don't think it's a causal link. I do think that the mental health crisis has a lot more to do with toxic social media, effects of the pandemic, and social isolation, and the really unfortunate reality of gun culture that our young people are faced with. I cannot tell you how many sessions that I have with young people focus on that fear of having to do shooter drills in school or at camp or wherever they are.
One of the things that I've become aware of is that us really is very sensitive.
Yeah.
I've been amazed.
Yeah. I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that camp is a really important place where kids can just be free and be themselves, and that it has not always historically provided the support for LGBTQ youth that we're seeing now. It took a long time to get there. It took a lot of education, a lot of conversations like this for camp to get to the place where it could be accommodating, whether that's providing gender neutral restrooms or cabins, or asking campers their pronouns, those types of things. I also think that we've come a long way, just in the Beth Hillel community, but also the Reformed Jewish community in general. Programs like the Gesher curriculum at Beth Emmet, which really center on educating young people at synagogue about identity and decision-making, I think is really crucial. And we're starting to see an evolution of, we hear lots of different terms, b'mitzvah, b-mitzvah, b'nai mitzvah, right? More inclusive terms that can bring people into the rituals that have been such an important part of our culture for centuries, that just maybe need a little bit of tweaking to adapt language, our very ancient language, to sort of these evolving identities that we're seeing in our young people. And yeah, I agree. Camp has really come a long way, and us sororities work really hard to get there. And that matters for kids because they feel safe, they feel they can be themselves. And that is the #1 way to reduce mental health crises over time, is that kids feel like they have a safe and supportive place to be themselves, whether that's at camp, whether that's at synagogue or their schools. Those changes really do go a long way. Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. And I'm not quite sure how to phrase it, but people that are transgender, and I know it's all across the board, but typically, if somebody is transgender, does that also mean that they are gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, or all of the
Nope.
above, or none of the above?
It depends. It totally depends. They're not, again, correlation doesn't equal causation, because if you think, oh, can you guys see me anymore, by the way?
Actually, no.
Okay, because I was going to hold up this
No.
gender unicorn, but that's not helpful. I'll send it to you. But basically, thinking back to the ways that sexual identity and gender identity are intersecting but not the same is a really helpful way to answer that question, right? Because transgender is a gender identity. It's not a sexual identity. So somebody who identifies as transgender, I guess I didn't review these terms, but transmasculine, meaning someone who is assigned female at birth and has transitioned to identify as male, or transfeminine, someone who is assigned male at birth but has transitioned to identify as female. Let's say someone who's transmasculine, for example, they were assigned female at birth, but they identify as male. They may be straight, they may be gay. That doesn't have anything to do with how they identify as their gender. Does that help a little?
Yeah, actually it does that, and having a respectful conversation too. Like you say, it's I think it's the best thing to do is to, have conversations and not be afraid to talk about it in a respectful way, of course.
Absolutely. And I think respect and curiosity go a super, super long way. I will hear kids use terms and I have no idea what they mean. And sometimes what I do is I then go look it up on my phone afterwards because I feel embarrassed. And then I realize that that isn't necessarily the most helpful for our relationship. And that when I've done a little bit of research and maybe I feel a little bit more confident to have those conversations, I can go back to that person and say, you use the word ace to describe yourself. I think I know what that means, but can you tell me what that means to you? And it just opens up a whole dialogue that you wouldn't otherwise have if you're just like, let me Google this and then check it off my list of vocab, which I have done. You're not alone if you've done that before, but don't stop there. Bring it back to that young person and have that conversation. All of the above, because I do also work with a lot of Spanish speakers. That's a whole other conversation for how these terms translate into other languages. A lot does get lost in translation. So I would say both and, a typical therapist answer of both and. But just know that you're not alone if you've ever done that. If you've heard a term, you don't know what it means, you look it up, you feel stupid. It's okay. There's a lot of vocab out there. We just scratched the surface today. But the best thing to do is to do your research and then have a conversation.
And I'm finding him love
Yeah.
books about because it's something they know that we don't know.
Absolutely. I'll leave you with, I think, one of the best examples of that, which was when I was the director of youth programs at Beth Emmet Synagogue. The youth group, which was called Bessie, so their equivalent of Crafty, had a brainstorm session about what kind of social justice programs we want to do this year. And all these kids wanted to do a program about gender. It was my first year. I was like, sure, let's do a program about gender. These high school students, first year, they developed a program about gender for their peers, where they had their peers come in and they created art pieces, they looked at music, they talked about gender amongst themselves. It was a huge success, so much so that the next year we had an intergenerational program about gender. We had 4 generations in the room of people who came to learn from young people about gender. Of course, older folks also had a lot of information and knowledge to share, but the opportunity for young people to educate people who they love and care about in a safe space was one of the most empowering things I've ever seen. And I think any opportunity for kids to feel like experts, which they truly are on this topic and many others, is a great way to sort of bridge the divide and really meet them where they're at and allow them to share their knowledge and expertise with us. So for those of you who are on Zoom, we will send you the often referenced gender unicorn as well as the presentation, which you can feel free to look through. And please do reach out to me if you have questions about this specifically or about youth services. If you do know somebody who you feel like needs some additional support, whether mental health or peer support.
Someone wants to get in.
Oh, Mary Beth, she got kicked out. Please do refer them to youth services. We're located in Glenview, so it's not too far. And we also do provide virtual services. So, and in group settings, but as well as the Trans Youth and Family Summit, which occurs on an annual basis. It's an event that is for everyone from everywhere. So please do continue to keep us in mind and reach out if you do have any questions that come to you in the middle of the night.